Born into a respectable family in Washington, D.C. in 1870, Albert Fish's immediate family had a history of mental illness and alcoholism. A few of his relatives had perished in mental institutions. At the age of 5, Fish's father died. His mother was forced to work and was unable to care for him, so Fish was sent to an orphanage. Here, Fish recalls, "I saw so many boys whipped, it took root in my head." Fish became a painter and decorator, eventually marrying for 20 years and fathering 6 children. But when his wife left him for another man, leaving Fish to raise the children alone, he began to dangerously unravel, his madness fueled by a growing interest in cannibalism and religion. Fish began to indulge in raw meat at dinner, often serving it to his children, who would later testify he would do this on nights when the moon was full. Though he was said to never have physically abused his children, he did encourage them and their friends to pound his buttocks with a self-made paddle studded with inch-long nails.
There was a period of his life where he went off to Europe and apparently spent a lot of time in these male brothels. I think he was probably a male prostitute himself and indulged in all kinds of sadomasochistic homosexual stuff.
In New York City on May 28, 1928, 58-year-old Albert Fish responded to an ad placed in the New York World Classifieds by an 18-year-old boy named Edward Budd. The young boy was seeking employment. Fish, a house painter, deeply religious man, and father of 6, paid a visit to the Budd family at 406 West 15th Street, under the pretense of hiring Edward to work on his farmland upstate. On the day Fish appeared at the Budd residence for the first time, he stood bearing strawberries and pot cheese from a German deli. He appeared to be a kind, gracious man, white-haired, slightly feeble, and even genteel.
Fish is regarded by many aficionados of crime as the scariest and most deranged of all American serial killers. Partly, I think it was because he seemed so benign. At the time of his arrest, he was this old, grandfatherly-looking guy. I mean, seemingly very, very benign and harmless, sort of stoop-shouldered and grizzled. But he was an incredibly demented child murderer, torturer, who had spent really his whole life preying on young children.
Fish could have easily passed for someone's grandfather, but this was not your average grandfather. Edward Budd was thrilled at the prospect of summer employment with the affable old-timer, and Fish quickly earned the trust of Albert and Delia Budd. Once Fish laid eyes on 12-year-old Grace Budd, he had a diabolical change of his ghoulish heart. Enchanted by the small girl, Fish quickly switched gears and promised Edward that he would return in a few days to bring him to the farmhouse. Fish then insisted on taking Grace along to his niece's birthday party later that night. The Budds, reluctant at first, finally decided to allow Grace to go along with Fish. They would never see their daughter alive again. In 1930, Grace Budd's abduction had still gone unsolved. Over time, Fish developed an obsession with writing obscene letters to widows, responding to advertisements in both personal and matrimonial agencies. But he wasn't your average gentleman caller. Fish wasn't interested in dinner and a movie. He asked the women if they would like to beat him or join him in whipping small boys. Fish underwent psychiatric evaluations off and on throughout his lifetime. Doctors would later diagnose Fish as having an abnormal psychopathic personality with a hint of early senility, but he wasn't considered to be insane. It would be 4 more years before the whereabouts of Grace Budd would be discovered. The case was resolved because of one last haunting letter scribed by Fish, but this letter was not intended for a lonely widower. It was sent to Albert and Delia Budd, whom knew a loneliness of a much darker strain. The letter read,
"My dear Mrs. Budd, I call on you at 406 West 15th Street. Brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her, though I could have had I wished. She died a virgin.
After dismembering her body, most of which he left behind in a closet, Fish would carry a portion of flesh by train to his house in the city, where he stewed the flesh with onions and carrots, deriving sexual pleasure as he consumed her. Fish's letter from hell was unsigned, but police were able to discern the letter's distinctive stationery. At the time, Fish was living in a rooming house. Police tracked him down and arrested him. Among the materials found in his possession were old newspaper clippings about Fritz Hermann, the German vampire who killed young men before selling their flesh in the marketplace. An outraged policeman asked Fish about his cannibalization of Grace Budd. "It occurred to me," Fish replied.
Fish's story and Fish himself seemed to be like the flesh and blood incarnation of all of these kinds of fairy tale monsters that you are so fascinated and terrified and titillated by when you're a child. The harm. It's like the witch in Hansel and Gretel or something. The seemingly harmless old person who offers you candy and then turns out to be a cannibal. So there's something very, very fascinating when you see one of these mythic monsters sort of step off the pages of the Grimm brothers and inhabit the real world.
Fish was charged with the murder of Grace Budd. He also confessed to at least 100 other incidents. "I've had children in every state," Fish teased. He was sentenced to die in the electric chair at Sing Sing. On January 16, 1936, Fish ate his last meals. For lunch, he had a T-bone steak. For dinner, he had a roast chicken, but he barely touched it. Later that night, after a 6-year manhunt, the state of New York finally put an end to Fish's unspeakable appetites by executing him in the electric chair. Fish had even been looking forward to his electrocution. "It'll be the supreme thrill, the only one I haven't tried," he exclaimed. But even Fish's execution didn't come off easy.
When he was in jail, he began complaining that he was having this difficulty sitting and so on and so forth. And when the prison physicians came to talk to him about it, he said that one form of pleasure that he got was inserting needles up between his legs into his perineum and leaving them lodged inside his lower body. And of course nobody believed this was the case, and they x-rayed him, and in fact they found, when the x-rays were developed, they found there were 27 needles of varying sizes that were shoved up into his pelvic region. This was just one of many forms of incredibly masochistic behavior that Fish indulged in. He was a masochist and a sadist, a classic case of someone for whom pleasure and pain are completely inseparable.
During the electrocution, all of the metal in his body caused a short circuit during the first shock. It took 2 massive jolts of electricity to kill him. At age 65, Fish was the oldest man ever executed at Sing Sing. So 50 years before America's favorite cinematic carnivore, Hannibal Lecter, there was Albert Fish, house painter, father of 6, and cannibal.